thank you very much, everyone, for joining today's session. The title of the panel event of this year, first panel event, is A Definite Social Relation Between Men That Assumes in Their Eyes the Fantastic Form of a Relation Between Things. This is a quote, Capital, Imperialism, and the Secret Lives of Place and Prosthesis. So we are honored to have two presenters today with us. Ventour-Griffiths, who will be presenting on Cosmic Afterlives, Black Psychogeography through Marvel's Looking Glass, and Aybas, who will be presenting on a critical analysis of assistive technologies, a commodity or an appendage. Elif will be starting the session, and each presenter will be presenting for 20 minutes. This will be followed by a 5-minute comfort break, and then we will have the usual Q&A. So we intend to finish this session in about an hour and a half. We will be recording the entire session, so if you don't wish for your camera to be part of this recording, especially during the presentations, please do turn off your cameras. And the captions have been enabled. We have an upcoming conference that the MDN is co-organizing with the disability stream of the Socio-Legal Studies Association, and this conference will be held over 2 half days in mid-June. A call for papers was sent out to the mailing list today. If you haven't received it, please do email me or any of the other members of the steering committee for details. I will stop there. Elif, please go ahead.
Hello, good evening. I shall start with thanking to everyone that gave effort to this network. I'm so happy to be here and to be a part of this network. Actually, there were 2 motivations that led this research that I completed for my master's thesis. And the first one is very personal, maybe individual, I say. As a visually impaired person, I really rely on technology in every aspect of my life, while participating in social life, in education, in employment. And I always wondered, my disabled and my blind ancestors, who didn't have these advanced technologies that I am using right now. Then the second group of motivations, more interested in the improving role of technology in the disability discourse and disability activism. Maybe it can be thought in terms of the how the technology can improve the conditions of the disabled people, and it turns into a really large market in terms of the assistive technologies. And another issue is that maybe there are these discussions that if the engineering model and the discourse on the technology can replace the medical model, because instead of the medicine, we are always talking about technology and its abilities to fix the abnormal body of the disabled. So I decided to write a thesis on assistive technologies. And when it comes to the field research, I have to choose one particular instance, one particular case, one particular assistive technology, and it was prosthesis and orthosis, because it has a really long history and institutionalized history go along with the industrialization and modernization of the state. Maybe I shall continue with a brief descriptions of prosthesis and orthosis and some other concepts that I am going to use throughout this presentation. Prosthesis means the artificial limbs that are supposed to replace a non-existing limb, while the orthosis are supposed to enhance the functionality of an existing limb. For instance, a spinal corset or a bone plate, both can be a orthosis. SUT, actually, this is a Turkish abbreviation that we call in Turkish Sağlık Uygulama Tebliği, and its English is like health implication notices. These are the regulations announced by the social security institutions, and all the procedures, all the prices regarding the medical devices, and the shares that the people have to pay to be included within the social security coverage should pay. All of them are regulated by this SUS, and these were very important for me for my field research. During my field research, actually, I benefited a wide range of resources. I started with interviews, deep interviews with 8 prosthesis users. Actually, generally, mainly I chose leg prosthesis users, 8 users I interviewed with. 1 physician, 1 orthopedist doctor, and 1 technician working on the prosthetic and orthotic area. Also, I really benefited benefited websites, forum sites where disabled people share their experiences regarding their assistive technologies. And other than this, actually, I read the publications of medical conferences on prosthesis and orthosis. I think they were really helpful because they showed me the tendencies and approaches of the medical field to the prosthesis and orthosis and disability and amputation, etc. Also, the product catalogs and the websites of the firms, the private firms, producing these limbs were very helpful for me to see the market dynamics and commercial dynamics as well. Also, I read the works of historians to see micro historians specifically to see the histories of these devices. These are the main resources that my field research was based on. When it comes to the literature review, actually, we are lucky that improving and improving literature is available right now on the assistive technologies. To say very first examples regarding assistive technologies came from the rehabilitation studies, and a very empirical field actually, and I think it's really good because this studies really provide empirical data for thinking on theory. And then theoretically, I really benefited from disability studies, science, technology, and society studies. I try to intersect. I studied at the intersection of these disciplines mainly. And the thing is that actually it was interesting to see how those disciplines experienced a similar shift from a structuralist to a more post-structuralist approaches, actually. They shifted their focus from the institutions, structures, and social phenomena to subjects, agency, and maybe the particular cases of the body or the disabled person themselves. Maybe in a time this shift may be clearer in our minds. But I'll give several works, several examples that how this shift is reflected in the works on assistive technologies. Actually, the first works that we can include within more structuralist views on assistive technologies can be Julie Anderson's work. She's from University of Kent, and actually she is more interested in how in commodification processes of this prosthesis and orthesis, and how the organization of the field is directly related to the industrialization. And the other example is from David Serlin, and he's from the University of California, San Diego. And he is interested in seeing the relation between army as a very old institution and manhood and understanding of the disability and amputation prosthesis as well. When it comes to the more post-structuralist approaches, actually, we can include the discussions related to the subjectivities of this people using prosthesis and orthesis. For instance, I studied the work of Margaret Shildrick from Stockholm University. She's contributed by Donna Haraway's work on cyber myth, and she's mainly focusing on the understanding of these people about their selfhood and what might be the facilities that this prosthesis can bring us to consider the relation between technology and human using the concept of post-human. Gil Haddo, another scholar that we can include within the post-structuralist views on assistive technologies, and she is mainly working on ICDs, the devices that regulate the heart rhythm, and how the people using these devices experience their own body, and how their experiences change in the time, and what are the variables affecting these experiences. Well, actually, of course, the literature is really large, even right now. But I chose this verse just to give a brief examples to explain this move actually in the literature. So I tried to use both of these approaches to have a top and down and down and top approaches to the field. And it was a methodical. I saw these approaches, different approaches, as different methods to engage in the field. Actually, the specific interest of my research can be a reply to the criticism of Alan Ralston. Alan Ralston criticizes the literature not having that much data related to the undeveloped and developing countries, and it's being more focused on developed countries and more industrialized countries. I tried to see how my research, aiming to compare different cases from UK, USA, and Ottomans and Turkish Republic, can be influential on the theories of assistive technologies. Because actually, I think such a comparison shows greatly the global networks of production regarding these devices, because developing countries and undeveloped countries still mainly dependent on exported items, and it means a great economical burden and for national context and individual level as well, and uncertainty because of the exchange rate changes. Well, actually, I conducted my research in 3 lines. The first line was about the historical formation of the field, and I was trying to compare as much as my data allow me. I tried to compare USA, UK, and Ottoman cases in terms of the formation of the field. I'm in the profession, the market, etc. Secondly, I focused on the contemporary Turkey. I just tried to see the market dynamics, the social security implications, rehabilitation, and professional dynamics, and very basic dynamics of the field. I just try to see them in the contemporary Turkey case. Lastly, I try to understand the subjectivities, the subjectification processes of the disabled people using prosthesis and orthesis. I mean, the identity formation of disability, the gender roles, independent living, and public visibility. Actually, when I say public visibility, I am indicating to the pride issue at some point. Yes, this was the last chapter I was interested in, the last line of inquiry of my research. Today, I am rather focus on the first line of inquiry, which is related to the historical formation of the field in different contexts. Well, actually, the first private firms in UK were in late 18th century, while in USA it was like around mid 19th century, and specifically during Civil War. Of course, there are several attempts before the Civil War, but the Civil War was a great milestone in terms of the institutionalization of the realm in USA. For the Ottomans, actually, we had to wait until the end of the 19th century to see the first attempts, not the firms actually. Yes, there was just one firm, which was a really small one, but mainly the first attempts in the production of the prosthesis and artificial limbs was under army and workshops under army. After this brief introduction, maybe we can go through several reasons that paved way to the institutionalization of the realm. Actually, prosthetic and orthotic markets was highly contributed by the hard working conditions and great wars that cause large numbers of casualties, and so it meant a great loss of labor, and society had to deal with this labor shortage. So then it means a great demand for this prosthetic and orthotic devices. And then the first attempts to supply these devices for the demand, actually, it's not a coincidence that the first attempts started around at late 18th century. Fortunately, the medical improvements led the successful surgical operations, avoiding bleeding, allowing antiseptics and avoiding other technical problems that might occur during the amputations. And then we shall talk about the engineering and the developing engineering techniques that might use raw materials in more desired way and more flexible way. And then the specialization of the profession as well, because before the Industrial Revolution, of course, there were several artificial limbs. We are all familiar with these wooden legs narratives. But mainly the production of artificial limb was a carpentry activity. And after the Industrial Revolution, combining the medical and engineering technique, a separate profession of artificial limb became, emerged. And lastly, we shall talk about the improvements in the modern state, because there should be a central attempt to regulate the field in terms of production, delivery, and consumption, because these prostheses are really expensive in the past and present as well. And there should be some contributions for the middle and working class people to be able to buy these devices. At first point, the philanthropy was on the stage to help the people and to compensate the money. But in the time, through the pension funds, etc., state took the role. Then we have several cases that microhistorians brought their stories to us. I included them in my presentation to see how their stories can enlighten our way to see the realm in the history. Firstly, I included Marquis of Anglesey. He was injured in Waterloo, and he had to take this prosthesis. He had to use it, and he ordered several prostheses during his life to James Podge, who was living and working in London. Actually, all these processes were written. He ordered his prostheses by writing, and his prostheses were sent to him by ship. And for all the equipments and adjustments, he wrote again. So actually,
sorry to interrupt. 2 minutes left. Thank
okay. So this was the first case that we include, and he shows us that even as a marquis, he can order several prostheses, but it was really expensive, and in the time there should be an intervention for the middle class or working class to be able to buy these devices. Well, actually, I'm so behind, but I'll stop here. Maybe if you like, then you can read the presentations, which is in the mail. So if you like, then you can contact me. I am there as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elif. And I apologize for not reading your bio earlier and not introducing you. I was on my phone and I was just trying to deal with a lot of things at once. So I will do so now. So Elif is a graduate of Bogazici University in Istanbul with a bachelor's degree in political science and international relations and a master's degree in sociology. And in the summer of 2022, Elif participated in the Globalization Studies and Critical Theory Summer School at the University of Bologna. So thank you so much, Elif, for a wonderful presentation. We will have the chance to discuss more during the Q&A. And now I move on to Tre Ventour-Griffiths, who will be presenting on cosmic afterlives, Black psychogeography through Marvel's Looking Glass. And Tre is a multiply disabled historian, creative writer and sociologist with interests in Black histories, race and disability, pop culture, and insurgent politics. His PhD research uses creative storytelling methods to consider a multi-generational story of Caribbean North Hands post-1942. Tre's work in popular culture looked at representation, identity, and political commentaries in the history, writing, and development of popular entertainment, namely comics, film, and TV. So Tre, please go ahead.
Awesome. Okay, evening everyone. Welcome to my paper, Cosmic Afterlives, Black Disabled Psychogeographies through Marvel's Looking Glass, and it focuses on my experiences of space, place, and buildings through Guy DeBord's theory of psychogeography, which I'll explain in a minute. And it also focuses on Northamptonshire. So it's basically an autobiographical exploration of that. And Northamptonshire, for people that are watching overseas, is a county within the Midlands region of England in the UK. Cosmic considers psychogeography through a metaphor of the fictional Marvel Infinity Stones, but more specifically the Soul Stone, one of 6 fictional entities that controls vital aspects of the Marvel universe: reality, time, space, soul, power, and the mind. The Soul Stone in particular allows users to control, alter, steal, and manipulate living and dead souls, a metaphor for thinking about spaces and places and how they affect the emotions. And for me, that's in I guess, provincial Britain, and so in the countryside and small towns and so on. Psychogeography got me to think about the spirits of slave owners in country houses as hostile to Black visitors like me, as much as these spirits are attractive to white visitors and staff. In that way, their wide rooms, grounds, and tall ceilings allow white people to escape into sunshine slavery and basically what I call the colonial afterlife of Jane Austen in country houses and so on. Rafia Zakaria further writes about this in Against White Feminism, and she says at a time when white women were still the legal property of their husbands, the opportunity to taste a little power was too tantalizing to resist. So psychogeography is a term that comes from the Marxist tradition of the 1950s, popularized by French Marxist Guy DeBord, to define how spaces and places impact the emotions. As lots of work it has been used to explore urban cities. As a Black disabled person who spent lots of my life in small towns and the countryside in Britain, this is something I thought about in UK conversations of Black access to the rural. Currently, psychogeography is something I began to think about alongside the cosmic elements of the Marvel universe as a way to visualize what scholar Elizabeth Freeman talks about as a shock to the common sense that may release enough energy to blow out a few institutional fuses. So disabled and Black, my access to the countryside arrives with being seen within that logic of chattel slavery or enslavement, since in rural Britain, how Black people are seen is in view of labour, revisiting the plantation. Continued Black experiences of rural country estates do not position us as belonging in it, although the Black presence in rural Britain goes back many, many centuries. How Black people experience these places meets the remit of whiteness, mirrored across society, that Ghislaine Kinrani further writes as the ways the structure of white supremacy becomes embedded, normalized, and inscribed within modes of feeling, thinking, being, and on the world to maintain the illusion of white superiority. Kanani's description of whiteness as the everyday performance of white supremacy is something I came to think or see imbued in country estates and really country living. We go to these places that were built on the backs of Black labour, and at least some of them, and that spirit of white supremacy is laced into the building. So I go to these places and feel a bit off-centred. A feeling hangs in the air, pushing me away, saying something along the lines of, leave now, death here. Country houses as products of chattel enslavement, at least some of them, I came to see them as monuments to Black genocide, and the ghosts that remain there are both of victims and of perpetrators. Since the George Floyd protests of 2020, we've seen lots of discussions of why Black people should be in spaces like that. Very little about why we should want to as well. There are unseen dangers for us in empire institutions. In the words of Sorcerer Wong from Doctor Strange, while heroes like the Avengers fight physical dangers, we sorcerers fight more mystical threats. So I came to think about buildings as living objects able to spellcast what we call microaggressions. So thinking about whiteness then as enchantment. So the buildings of historic spaces like country houses and many universities absorb that power in say one time period, like a virus, mutating, splitting, growing, reproducing, adapting, multiplying, and then later on radiating that energy in what we call the now. Mainly for my own benefit, I came to refer to that, that process as anthropomorphic whiteness, and basically it's a compound term from English literature and sociology. So anthropomorphism is a poetical device that we use in poetry, where you basically give human, emotions to inanimate objects, and then morphed it into sociology with things like critical whiteness studies. So basically, how buildings can behave like humans in that sense, including taking on the behaviours of white supremacy, which was made by humans too. So anthropomorphic whiteness to describe how historic buildings or objects like buildings may take on human traits like whiteness, racism, basically as spiritual warfare. They enchant white visitors, empowering them to do terror against Black visitors and staff. The levels of policing our colleagues have experienced is monumental. So the country house empowers white women in particular in the same way, say, somewhere like the pub or the aesthetic of the pub empowers white male behaviour at the same time. We must also think about if Black people need to be included in everything white people have. And if the representation politics that has overlooked what racism does to the spirit. So in my culture as well, so the Caribbean islands of Jamaica and Grenada, we call that spirit Duppy, which Bob Marley actually wrote a song about in 1973 called Duppy Conqueror, and it features on his album Burning as well. And it's a really good song, and I always go back to it as a point of reference for this. So thinking about Marvel and how certain spaces carry energy, I come back to that idea of how spirit in a context of spiritual racism that occupies the country house via historical manifestations of empire. So Guy Debord's Psychogeography is basically a vehicle for that idea, for what we can develop on out of its, urban city origins into debates of hauntings, ghosts, and how buildings themselves become the ghost. Since heritage is also dominated or is very white and middle class as well. Most of the women I encounter in that space as well are white. So I read one report by Historic England that described the workforce in the heritage sector as 90% white and 66% women, which may speak to the ways in which white female privilege runs through heritage organisations and these estates. Here, at least, in my experience, blackness comes to be rendered disabled through white supremacy as a disabling process. For example, as well, like in Jane Austen's work, these properties are places in which white women can escape, upheld by histories of black labour. So the slave trade overseas is what's keeping those estates alive. So black people at these sites are seen as visitors or even labourers. Is blackness the only altar of difference made disabled by capitalism then? No, but that does not mean there is ever a form of capitalism that is not protected by or sustained by white womanhood. Such instances in the United States, for example, like Central Park Karen during 2000, I think it's 2020 now, revisits how at the micro level, white womanhood is the right hand to white malehood, and will sort and stack people into groups, even their own, in order to get one up and get more in that sense. So my experiences of country houses revisit that dynamic where blackness is also rendered disabled under, I guess, white terrorism, what we call white terrorism. So I looked at Bell Hooks's work on that, and also George Yancey and people like that who write about white terror and the intimacy of that experience. As a historian as well, and as a sociologist, one of my most useful ways for researching things has actually been walking. And for my work on texts like Bridgerton and Jane Austen texts, walking these grounds stimulates the sense. So walking around Delapre Abbey as well, which is an English independent heritage site based in Northampton in England, I'm haunted by those unquiet memories. Something went on there. And as I'm walking, one is often stared at like you don't belong in these spaces, as if you don't belong. Here as well as in, and also in conversation as well on these sites, you can sometimes be asked like, why are you here? And like they don't expect you to be there. So there's an empowerment that especially white women have in these spaces where they might draw power from the aesthetic of the country house. In the same way, white men feel empowered at the pub to act in ways that they know they'll never be held accountable for. So, and these are spaces that ultimately protect whiteness and also patriarchy as well. Karl Powell and Holly Henderson's analysis of UK higher education gender equality frameworks, Athena Swan, shows how equality, diversity and inclusion initiatives, so EDI, benefit middle-class white women more than any other group. In the US as well, sociologist Jesse Daniels further writes in her recent book, Nice White Ladies, how affirmative action, and I quote here, has moved white women into a structural position in which they share more in common with white men than they do with black women or Latina women. So white women staff render black people invisible in these places. These spaces in the 19th century, though, privileged white women both as slave owners and also as slave owners and the relatives of slave owners too. Because in the slave trade compensation records, women made up 40% of claims. So in that colonial afterlife of Jane Austen, we as black people walk these spaces to be met with what I call sunshine slavery and also the shrill of escapism. So that colonial blood splatter is on the walls, where the constants of like, why are you here? What are you doing here? That can dysregulate black nervous systems. So the fields, the lakes and the gardens are like prisons in that sense, the plantation, permanence. So you can see how the countryside in Britain is sort of just the mirror to what the plantation was in the Caribbean. In 1987, novelist Toni Morrison coined this term, rememory, to discuss the act of recalling repressed memories that can be obscured or haunted, and even by recalling the memories of ancestors and what they experienced. She coined it in American context of enslavement. So navigating, I guess, the British rural, I'm brought back to that and how I'm haunted by what my ancestors experienced as enslaved people. Sociologist Avery Gordon describes haunting as a state which abusive systems of power reveal themselves, and their impact felt in our daily lives. I use the term haunting to describe those singular yet repetitive instances when home becomes unfamiliar, writes Gordon, when your bearings on the world lose direction, when the over and done with comes alive, when what's been in your blind spot comes into view. Haunting raises spectres, and it alters the experience of being in time, the way we separate the past, the present, and the future. So, navigating Delapre Abbey, then pictured at the bottom, I'm haunted by what my ancestors experienced. It takes me to what I experience as one of the most haunting lines in all of English literature. So, in the opening lines of Rebecca, Daphne du Maurier tells us that last night I dreamt I went to Mandalay again. And through Mandalay, I read Delapre Abbey just as much as I read somewhere like Buckingham Palace or many of the country estates across the UK. Delapre is effectively a metaphor for that boomerang effect of economic violence. So the brutality that happened in the Caribbean on plantations is what built those estates and much of Britain at the same time. So it's that boomerang of empire in that idea. When slave labour produced the money that went into country estates, that's still used to this day as, I guess, like tourist locations. So that coloniser's ghost haunts Britain, where these sites may well be mass graves or treated as such. So what I called anthropomorphic whiteness tells me how on those estates one comes to be hit with the blood splatter of ghosts. So Sarah Ahmed tells us that, Ahmed tells us the past is living rather than dead. It lives in the very wounds that remain open in the present. So that also takes another turn, where my own family history is both of enslaver and enslaved people. So my maternal great-grandparents, Toyley and Edison Noel, arrived in Northampton from Grenada in the early 1960s in hope of a better life as part of the Windrush migration. As the descendants of enslaved people, they were also recolonized out of their rural, self-sufficient food pathways by British immigration policy when they left that life in 1960 for the UK, where the gaps in labour left by the war had many Caribbean people leaving those farms in the Caribbean for factory work, nursing and railway work and so on in Britain. So from enslavement to farming communities, my ancestors were people intimately tied to the land, connected to it, moved by it, buried on it. But where is home in that sense? Northampton or Grenada? So coming to Northampton, they would not have seen Delapre in the same way as I see it, as a keeper of secrets. But I do know that my great-grandmother, like many Caribbean women of her generation from the countryside, knew about ghosts in the village. And my grandmother, her daughter, tells me about them as well. So when Black visitors go to these country houses, are they haunted by their ancestors' murderers in that sense? So growing up, I harboured a lot of these feelings. So the slave compensation database, and I found my own family in the database as well there, answers some of these questions where family history is colonial history. So in walking Delapre, I am walking the rural Caribbean. And as Portia O also tells us, it informs which side of the whipping whip has your family's blood on it, what your name comes attached to. And for my family history, it's on both sides, as both enslaver and enslaved people. Volunteers at Delapre are now finding out there might be colonial links to how parts of the building were made, like the stables. But to corroborate that, they would need to go to visit the New York archives in the US, as it's an international story. So as the closer you are to the source of colonialism and empire, the less you see. Britain may have abolished the slave trade, but whoever heard of a spirit that actually really died in that sense, as per Sarah Ahmed's point. So buildings as living entities may come to spellcast the worst behaviours of their occupants. So this feeling, I think, is best shown actually not in an academic text, but there are many, but actually in Doctor Who. So the Doctor Who episode Knock Knock, when Bill Potts and the Doctor went out a friend's house, and then the Doctor then notices there's something weird going on in the house when the floors and the walls creak and monsters start to crawl out of the woodwork, quite literally. So walking the grounds of Delapre, I'm also walking the fruits of my ancestors' labour. So a Black British psychogeography almost lays a ground root for thinking about Black relationships, not only to Black community spaces, but also what white spaces mean to us, beyond the physical. So through walking, I've come to see racism not only as a physical experience, but also a spiritual project, via buildings, statues, and street names. And for me, these are tangible portals to a not so distant past, that harbours empire and manifesting as part of the living dead. So as part of the Infinity Stones hypothesis, I guess that Soul Stone allegory represents racism as spirit, how Black people may be in spaces and haunted by the feelings that lived there is as much a Black psychogeography as it is a hauntology of Blackness. So today's conversations of Black access to country estates have not really asked this question. Just because we can diversify, does that mean we should diversify? Do we actually need everything white people have access to? I would actually say no, and I think we should be a bit more critical about what spaces we're putting ourselves in. But British colonial histories have focused on the real, but we don't really also ask what monsters also lurk in the dark at the same time. And that's country estates in, I think, less than 20 minutes. I think I've done it really quickly. But yeah, thanks very much for listening as well.
Thank you very much, Trey, for an excellent presentation. So who would like to pose the first question? Please either raise your hand via the Zoom buttons or perhaps raise your hands with the camera on. I think I can see everyone who's got their cameras on. And we'll wait a few seconds. Luke goes first.
Hi guys. So I have a question for each of you. I'm going to start with yourself first, Elif. So I'm really interested in the question of market formation for assistive technologies. It's something that Marxists need to look at more because it's so very clearly one of those places where states and market formations interact in ways that we don't often have a good model for. So my question for you is, after the war, how much of a role did the state take in stimulating demand for prostheses? Was the purchasing and distribution of aids mostly done through a health service, or was it driven by private firms seeking to rehabilitate skilled workers, or was this part of a general kind of, as in many of the Western European countries post-war, was this part of a kind of job retraining program to deal with a labour shortage that was run by employment offices or ministries of labour or something like that? If you could say a bit about that in the Turkish case, I'd be really, really grateful. I'd also be interested whether you've come across any instances of assistive technology constituting categories of disablement as far as the state are concerned. I'm thinking in particular in the British context of the way in which the manufacture of hearing aids led to recategorizations of deafness, basically relative to for whom would an aid be usable, right? So we had a new idea of what constituted deafness as a social relation based entirely around the technology. And in the Netherlands, the idea that the categories used to classify different kinds of blindness in the 16th, 17th century were directly dependent on lens grinding technology at the time. So I was wondering if there were analogous things within the Turkish context. Trey, I guess my question to you, I have a kind of conceptual and practical challenge to the conceptual framework that you're using. The first, thinking about the things that you said about haunting and the idea of monsters and sorcery in constituting race, I was reminded very strongly of the analysis by Karen and Barbara Fields in Racecraft, right, where they argue that the belief in race as a natural or metaphysical structure is effectively equivalent to the belief in witchcraft. It's a way of explaining existing inequalities by appeal to kind of magical thinking. I was wondering what your response would be to their next move, which is something like, and I'm paraphrasing heavily here, is the call not for us then to reject magical thinking? Is the call not then for us to say, well, these ghosts which have been projected onto the world, they are not in fact real. They are a mask which is worn by economic oppression and the class struggle between sectoral elites, right? Which then project these ideas of that there are, that we can meaningfully and substantively say things about black men or white women or something of that nature is simply accepting terms which are designed to obscure the social relations which we're actually interested in, which are relations of oppression, exploitation, and material inequality, as well as social, the removal of social freedom. And secondly, I suppose to give a kind of practical application of this, I am convinced, I think, of a lot of things you say about escape and privilege linked in with femininity when it comes to the consumer side of heritage, right? It's very clear, and we might argue about how, the motivations for this or the material effects it has, but it's very clear there's lots of kind of middle class white people who tend to be women who go along to these country houses to kind of play act at being in a Georgian colonial era kind of role play thing. But you mentioned a statistic about the employees of the heritage sector. I used to work in the heritage sector, so forgive me, I've had to read a bunch about this. A lot of those women employees are on a minimum wage. Often they are working in heritage because of a lack of labour mobility, because heritage will be a large employer in an area which now has no other industry, either through deindustrialization or through the kind of the town country contradiction, right? There were never many jobs there and they can't move away for whatever purposes. And actually, their ancestors, if we go back far enough, probably would have been the ladies in waiting, the kind of servants in these houses. So I wonder whether that's a case for the fields analysis, that actually these categories that we project, which are variegated by a use of whiteness or blackness that we feel intuitively like we understand but maybe can't substantiate, do not themselves hold up in aggregate when we look more closely at the social relations in question. Thanks so much for your time, and I hope that wasn't too garbled.
I want to answer the second one first, because I think that's a lot more direct for me to answer. I think what you're saying is that I think what you're saying is true. I also think not all white people are equally white as well. So whiteness isn't the same for everyone, but we all have a relationship to it. And I think I think there's a lot of scholarship around, especially in the 90s, there was stuff around Irish immigration into America, for example, and how the Irish became white. And equally, I think there was a book by, I think it was Jacobson, A Whiteness of a Different Color as well. So when you think about whiteness and who was allowed into it, it's constantly changing. But I think in country houses and so forth, there is a certain level of it's especially when it comes to popular culture and how country houses are reproduced in media, that you got a lot of these white female characters in, say, Bridgerton and things like that, and Jane Austen texts. And it's not about liberating women, it's about them replacing white men as the new capitalists. So there's a lot of that too. So I think when it comes to the 66% data that I pulled from Historic England, and I can get the link for anyone that's interested in that. I think when it comes to white womanhood, there is sort of there's a sharedness, I think, with it, irrespective of class, because I've experienced racism from white women from all levels on the class spectrum, in academia, but also in heritage, and also in other spaces as well, like poetry events and things like that. So from the working class to the middle class, and there is still a type of, I guess, entitlement that comes from, especially when it comes to when it's white women against black men. But then when it's white women against black women, it's a whole other dynamic that I'm not equipped to speak on because it's not my experience. But yeah, I think you're absolutely correct in terms of what you're saying. But also at the same time, not everyone is white equally, and there's levels to it. And similarly, and that's what I think that's what we call like intersectionality to some extent. That there were, I guess, intersections of whiteness that don't really get explored in the mass media context because it's difficult and it's hard, and it doesn't make a good headline. That certain white groups have less privilege than other white groups. Yet when it comes to oppressing people of color, they lump all white people together because that's generally that's sort of just what happens. But yeah, I think, and then your first question, I don't feel equipped I can answer it because I don't know enough about racecraft to answer that. I've read bits on it, but I don't want to speak on something that I've not read enough on. So sorry if I can't answer that.
Maybe I shall continue with your question on wars. Actually, I think firstly we might focus on the pension funds, because after this wars, there were a number of soldiers who were injured, and the state had to deal with the conditions and the reintegration of these soldiers into back. And the first and more direct way is pension funds. And if you are implementing pension funds, you need to deal with the scale of the disablement as well. So the direct result of the pension funds is the attempts for scaling the disability. In Ottomans, for instance, the first law for scaling the disability is in 1869. Actually, let's start with the first international attempt for the rights of veterans is in 1864 Geneva Convention. And also Ottomans is a signatory. And in 66, the first attempt for pension fund. Then in 69, there is the first law to scale the disability. Actually, it's important that this scaling is just categorizing disability into three, and not in terms of the sort of injuries or the ways that the people are injured, but just the dependence of the person. Are you able to move by your own without a device? Or can you move with a device? Or with a device, even you can't move by your own? Just three categories of disablements. So in the time, these categories of disability increase into 6, and still in the way of showing the dependence of the people. During the earlier time, we don't have this differentiation between visual impairments or orthopedic impairments, etc. I think this is very interesting because it's really good. It is a really good clue to see how the disability itself is constructed. This discourse of the disability itself is constructed within the history. Also, another issue that I might raise in this regard is that how different national contexts reacted to the after-war era. For instance, let's go to the First World War. In Britain, actually, especially around Manchester and especially around Chelsea. There were several workshops under different hospitals. Also, the private companies were invited to work in these institutions to produce large numbers of prostheses by British government. But in Ottomans, for instance, then Turkish Republic as well, after the during and after the First World War, mainly the Turkish Red Crescent were employed in collecting these prostheses for the injured people. And Red Crescent signed agreements with Austria to export different prosthetic items, prosthetic devices. I shall say that mainly I focused on leg prostheses to have a more, because of the limitations of the field research, I limited myself into the leg prostheses. So I don't have any other, I don't have so much data related to hearing aids, etc. Pension laws and rehabilitation studies as well, rehabilitation attempts, not just in the hospitals, but also through the employment facilities as well. I think this should be considered through different national contexts and how these different national contexts reacted to this issue of wars and war casualties. Yeah.
Thanks, Olive. I think Joanna might be frozen. So I'm going to jump in and try to chair the Q&A until she is able to rejoin us on the call. The next hand I saw up is Stu's. So Stu, would you like to jump in and ask your question?
Sorry, just trying to work this machine. I'm trusting at the same time, so this might come across really garbled. But we'll see how far my concentration moves. There's a question for Trey. Sorry, can you hear me?
We can. You're a little bit muffled, Stu, so try and speak slowly and clearly, but we can hear you.
Yeah, so it's just a question for Trey, or maybe a thought that it might not have come across with psychogeography, because it's a bit niche and buried in architectural history, but the work of Vakutamas, which is effectively the Soviet Bauhaus in the early 20s, they looked a lot at using architecture and buildings and space to influence emotion and personality, effectively. So it links in quite well with Guy DeBord and that kind of movement there. But it's just something that I thought you might find interesting to look at.
Thanks a lot. Can you put that in the chat as well?
Yeah, of course.
So I can see it, and if anyone else is interested, so they can see it as well.
Yeah, I'll put in a couple of books that I've read on the topic as well that I think would be helpful.
Okay, spot on. Thank you very much, Stu. Kavanagh, would you like to jump in next?
Sure. My question is to Elif. I was wondering if you were going to consider or look at experiences of prosthesis as restrictions. And I'm coming at this partly from personal experience and partly from my own research in that space, where my personal experience being as an amputee and as an amputee child, I was required to wear a prosthetic limb, which was both painful and restrictive in that my functioning was severely restricted by having to wear the prosthetic limb. And most of the people around me could see that it was very uncomfortable and it's given me lifelong back problems to boot. But at the same time, the requirement of like meeting societal norms on what the body should look like meant that it was okay to restrict functioning to that extent. And so this is a space that a lot of disabled people experience, where prosthetics are actually predominantly for social cohesion rather than for any kind of assistive, as opposed to any kind of assistive technology for our own, like to support our own needs. And parallelly, the other example that I have in mind is what are now, right now we have like arm transplants happening, and they essentially provide a person with a transplanted arm, but mean that they have to take perpetual immunosuppressive therapy for the rest of their lives because of that because it's a transplant. And one of the first people to receive this transplant essentially claimed that it was worse to be after the transplant than before, and opted to have the transplant removed later, and was treated as like being ungrateful for the service provided by medical technology.
Should I jump in, or should
Please.
I? Okay.
No, please jump in, comrade.
The thing is, I remember two interviewees actually. One of them was a 30 years old man, and regarding his experiences with his prosthesis, he said that through this amputation and through this prosthetic devices, he was not supposed to meet the standard or ordinary social responsibilities against his family, against whatever an ordinary person seemed to meet the social expectation from him. And he said that if I didn't use this prosthesis, probably I would leave the school and I would work for a minimum wage, and probably I would marry and have had children, etc. But through this amputation and this prosthesis worked like a a break for me from the social expectations, and I feel totally freer than I was supposed to, he said. Actually, at some point, it was a fine question, because not just the limitation is not just something related to physical mobility, but it is more about the social expectations, about the expectations from yourself, etc. So we have to think of the expectations, individual and social level, and how this prosthesis use can change it. Also, another interviewee talked about, not directly a response to you, but I think at some point it is related. A person using a prosthesis told me that he is lucky because he is using his prosthesis from his early ages, from his childhood, because he had time to adapt to the prosthesis socially and physically as well. Another person told that she was using her prosthesis after 25, I think. She told that she is lucky because she didn't have this childhood traumas regarding her prosthesis. And when she started to use her prosthesis, she already established her own selfhood. Then she thought that she was more able to deal with this prosthesis because already she is adult. So I think this is important because these cases, comparatively considered, also show the limitations and expectations are really influential regarding the satisfaction of this prosthesis. and the limitations, the understanding of the limitations as well.
Thank you very, very much indeed. I did see a little while ago a hand from Ariana. Ariana, do you still have a question that you want to jump in with?
Yes, yeah, I do. I wouldn't want to take up time if other people have questions or if Trend, if you want to expand on what has already been asked. Otherwise, I do have a question for each of you.
Ariana, I don't see any other hands. The floor is yours, comrade.
Okay. Yeah, thanks both so much for two really amazing presentations. Yeah, I apologize if my questions are not clear, please. Ask for clarification. I'm really foggy brained, so so if it's not clear, just tell me. And I will try to make it clearer. Yeah, so a question for Elif. I had many questions. It was such a fascinating presentation. I suppose the question I had was whether I really enjoyed many aspects of your presentation, but also how you ended up with a focus on, with a reflection on the uses of paying attention to the differences between nations in terms of how these market dynamics operate and how prosthetic production is organized. So I really enjoyed that comparative framework. And I think a question, and it was fascinating to hear how in Turkey prosthetic production continued within a more public sphere until more recently. So my question is whether, based on your research, what you have noticed in relation to the difference in the management, in the processes whereby disabled people are reintegrated into the workforce through prosthetic, through the production of prosthetics, but also I'm thinking of the specific pressures as far as medical establishment, welfare, so the state itself. I'm wondering about the differences, whether you've noticed that a pattern in the pressure, the regulation of disabled people by the state, in a context where prosthetic production is still within the public sector, as opposed to context where it's privatized. So I'm wondering about, if you could say more about those differences, and if you have identified any cause and effect, I don't know, any dynamic or correlation. And for Tre, I loved the presentation as well. So much food for thought, and I really loved the different dimensions at which you were examining the haunting that takes place around country houses, but your own experience of this, and just starting from this wonderful perspective of countries houses being persistent monuments to chattel slavery in ways that really reverberate through social relations and economic relations. So I was wondering where you see the possibility to challenge racial capitalism as embodied in the country houses, where you see most scope for challenging it, whether the level of aesthetics, and you talk a lot about this in terms of your creative work, or at the level of from a perspective more focused on work relations, contemporary work, economic relations, and solidarity at that level. So I was wondering about the different dimensions and where you see yourself as a participant in, as having encountered them, where you see most scope for challenging these monuments and their persisting status. Thanks so much. If what I've said is not clear, it makes sense that it's not clear. So please, tell me things.
Okay, I'm going to ask for your response first, Trey, and then we'll hand over to Isla.
Okay. I think for me, the place where I see challenge a lot easier, I think, is on, I guess, the everyday level, the local level. In your even just on your street where you live, and you talk to your neighbours about stuff and that sort of thing. Because I think it's quite easy to get overwhelmed by a lot of these issues. And when you break it down into that, if you can help solve problems on your road, for example, I've got a friend that does this as well. She started a community magazine out of this, a zine. It's not online; it's physical, because she doesn't like the digitization of media either. So it's a political statement of that. But she has a street party every year for her neighbours, so they all know each other. So I think that sort of thing really helps. But I think for me in Northampton, like Delaphree Abbey and myself are connected, because I've grown up going there, so they know who I am, and they know my parents and things like that. And there's that sort of I guess community relationship over the years. So there's been a conversation at least since before 2020. So I think on that level, they're open to having the conversation. Where it gets a bit more difficult is where it's on the more national level, when it's the bigger institutions. The bigger the institution, the harder the conversation is going to be, because you have more people to deal with. They put more blockages in your way, and that's where it gets a bit more difficult. In terms of challenging racial capitalism, I still think we're at a point where we need education on what capitalism is. Just to some extent, I think, especially I'm 30 this year, so I think many of my generation are, we've grown up in a context where unionizing wasn't not a thing for us when we were growing up. We've got family members that were part of strikes in the 80s and the 70s, but for us, this idea of worker strikes and stuff like that is completely new. I know about it because I've researched it in my work as a historian, but like your everyday person on the street who's my age probably won't have as I guess I know as much about it. In that sense, I think, like, what is capitalism? What does it do? What's the difference between capitalism and just and business growth? And you need to, I think that's what needs to happen on, I guess, we need to have a national conversation about capitalism in the same way that Black Lives Matter was a huge thing in 2020, in that sense. But yeah, and a lot of these words get thrown around. I think there needs to be like just a conversation around that on our local levels in our communities, and showing how, like, I guess, how capitalist violence has a local. It's not all big events. It's the local stuff as well. So why are there so many new housing projects built over green spaces, for example, which could be one example of how capitalism shows up in a local level. So things like gentrification, for example, would be an example of that on a street level. So I think I think the education side is really important, and I think a lot of it, once people are awake to the facts, they might feel empowered enough to go and do something about it. But I think until we get to that point, it's going to be quite a struggle, especially with academia, and how the tendency academia has to talk down to people as well. Like, just talk to people like they're people, I think, as well would be another thing. So I think, educate on capitalism. Just what is capitalism? What does it mean? And all of that sort of thing. And I think there's a lot of, I guess, misinformation being thrown about around that. But yeah, hopefully I've answered some of your question. But if I haven't, just say.
Amazing, thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Trey. Elif, I'm afraid, a pain in the ass, and I'm going to ask you to keep your response to a couple of minutes if you can. We're running a few minutes behind, which is fine because we started a few minutes late, but we don't want to keep it too many. So if you could try and answer Ariana's question in maybe 2.5 minutes, if that is that cool? Nice one. Go ahead, mate.
Should I?
Yes, please. Okay. Sorry, I possibly mumbled too much there. Please.
I really like the question, actually. This is a question, should be included in such a work on assistive technologies, because it is about knowledge production, professional knowledge production, and who is included and who is excluded within the processes of design, knowledge production regarding assistive technologies and prosthesis and orthesis. And I really like this, and I really want to think on this more and maybe investigating this more. And there is certainly a really large gap in different national contexts in this regard. For instance, the first patent on prosthesis and orthesis in USA in mid-19th century, Frank B. Palmer, who was awarded the first patent, and actually he was injured in a childhood accident. So through his own efforts for his own prosthesis, he designed for himself. So actually, yeah, there were other cases as well where the injured person, amputated person, designed, produced for himself or for herself, and then it became a business. For instance, there's this company, a German descended company, Ottobock, which is a really popular today and popularly preferred products they have. Also, I remember, the founder was also amputated. When it comes to Ottoman case and Turkish case, I don't have any information similar to those. The first people that worked in this era were sent to Paris at the end of the 19th century to study prosthetic techniques, and they were from the army dockyard, actually, army's dockyard. They are just technicians and engineers. They came to Ottomans back, Istanbul back, and they started to work in army. And I really don't know any example where a disabled person is included in the production process. After the foundation of Turkish Republic, actually, I saw that mainly the medical doctors took the place. For instance, the main materials I used was the medical conferences, because today, unlike the other cases where the private companies hold the era, here in Turkey, the orthopedist doctors have really large influence on the field. And yeah, this might be, yeah.
Thank you so much. And I can't see any further hands, so I'm going to call the meeting to a close. I'd like to thank both of our speakers for some really enjoyable, really illuminating presentations. I'm particularly looking forward to having a chance to read Elif's in full. And also Trey has sent some slides for his presentation around the group. So that will be anyone who wants to revisit some of those can have a look at them. And I believe both comrades have said that they'll be happy to be contacted for any further comments or questions which come up afterwards. So big virtual round of applause for them, if you'd be so kind. And I would like to remind comrades of our next meeting, which will be in a month on Tuesday, the 8th of April. Again, rather grandiosely titled with a Marx quote. In this society, unity appears as accidental, separation as normal, disablement, underclass, and emancipatory social ecology. Roddy Slorak will be giving a presentation on whether it is actually accurate to refer, as many of us, myself included, have to disabled people as an underclass or a surplus population, whereas Bob will be looking at different visions of socialism as mutually constituted autonomous relations and what meanings this might have for a disability liberation strategy. So please do join us then. It'll be wonderful to see as many of you as possible. Thank you to everyone for your discipline. Having done the AGM beforehand, we are running less than 10 minutes late in closing this meeting. That's a hell of an achievement, and it's certainly better than anything else I've managed today. So thank you all very much for your discipline in that regard. Over and out until April. Take care.